If anyone in this building realizes who you are, you will be dead before sunrise. 3 different men have already been paid to make sure of it. One of them is somewhere in this hallway, close enough that you can hear him breathing. You passed the first guard 12 minutes ago. The corridor was completely dark. You navigated it entirely by the sound of his footsteps. You smelled the second one before you saw him, lamp oil and river water, and pressed yourself into a wall recess for 4 minutes without moving, without making a sound, without letting your exhale exceed the ambient noise of the building. Your heart is at 140 beats per minute. Your face shows nothing. You are not a warrior. Warriors are loud. Warriors are meant to be seen. Your entire job is the opposite, and the history books have been getting people like you wrong for 500 years. Everyone thinks they know what a ninja looks like. The black suit, the mask, the throwing stars, the rooftop silhouette against a full moon. Most of that image was invented in the 20th century. Almost none of it matches historical reality. The actual shinobi, the correct term for what you are, was not a supernatural assassin. You were an intelligence operative, a saboteur, a specialist in psychological warfare and controlled infiltration. Your most important weapon was not a blade. It was information. And the biological cost of acquiring that information is something no film has ever shown you. This is what it actually took to be a ninja in real life. You were not recruited, you were born into it, and the distinction matters. The shinobi tradition was family-based, concentrated in the Iga and Koka regions of feudal Japan. Mountainous, isolated, terrain that suited a community built entirely around secrecy. Your father was a shinobi. Your mother understood the tradecraft. Knowledge passed through bloodlines because the entire system depended on absolute trust, and absolute trust meant family. Training started before you were old enough to understand what it was. By 5, you were learning to move quietly across different surfaces: tatami, gravel, wet wood. By 8, you were studying which plants reduced fever, which induced vomiting, and which ones stopped a heart. By 10, you were reading a person's emotional state from the angle of their shoulders before they opened their mouth. This was not training the way most people imagine it. Your entire childhood was the curriculum. The psychological requirement was the one that separated functional shinobi from those who broke. You were required to become comfortable with sustained ambiguity, never knowing if your cover was intact, never knowing if the man you'd been speaking to for 3 days already knew who you were and was simply waiting. Modern neuroscience maps that state directly to permanently elevated stress hormones and destroyed sleep. You lived inside it for your entire career. The tradition called it heightened awareness. Your nervous system called it something considerably less poetic. The ninjutsu curriculum covered 18 core disciplines. Combat was on that list. It was not at the top. Above it were things like espionage, disguise, psychological manipulation, fire use, and water crossing. You were not being built into a fighter. You were being built into a system. But the physical demands carved themselves into you permanently. And they didn't arrive as 3 separate lessons. They arrived as one continuous process of the body being reshaped by what it was asked to do year after year, until the tool and the person became the same thing. You are 12 when your instructor makes you walk across gravel for 3 hours without sound. By 15, your foot has learned to roll heel to toe, weight distributed so gradually that impact disappears. By the age of 20, the plantar fascia, the connective tissue along your arch, is in permanent tension. The first step out of bed every morning sends a shot of pain through your foot that you have stopped registering as pain and started registering as confirmation that you are still alive. The hands come next. Wall scaling, rope work, iron claws called shuko worn across the palm. These build the flexor tendons in your fingers into something that a physician would measure twice in disbelief. Your fingers can hold your full body weight from a 2-finger ledge grip on a surface most people couldn't even feel. In cold weather, they ache from the inside outward, deep in the joint, in a way that no amount of warming fully resolves. The strength and the damage arrive together. You cannot have one without the other. Your vision rewires last, and this is the change you notice most. Shinobi are taught to use peripheral vision as the primary detection system in darkness, correctly understanding that the rod photoreceptors responsible for low-light vision concentrate at the edges of the retina, not the center. You train yourself not to look directly at what you are trying to see, to look slightly past it, using the outer field. After years of this, the rewiring runs deep. Even in daylight, even in safety, your eyes sweep the edges of every room you enter before they settle on anything at the center. You cannot stop it. You stopped trying years ago. If you're still here, subscribe now, because everything we've talked about so far is only the beginning. Chapter 3 is where the real cost of becoming a shinobi starts to show, and it's the part the mythology was designed to hide. A guard stops you in the hallway. He asks where you came from. You tell him you are traveling from Osaka on behalf of a ceramic merchant named Ishida, that you carry a letter of passage authorized by the domain steward, that you arrived this afternoon and were shown to the east guest room by a servant whose name you gave him without hesitation. You maintain eye contact at exactly the correct level, enough to appear confident, not enough to appear challenging. He nods. He lets you pass. None of that was true. All of it was practiced until it felt like memory. The mission the mythology imagines the black-clad figure dropping from a rooftop is perhaps 5% of actual shinobi operational activity. The other 95% was that hallway, 11 days of being someone who didn't exist, knowing the name of his wife, his supplier, the specific ceramic he prefers. You memorize these details until they sat in your mind the way real memories sit without effort, without retrieval delay, because any gap between the question and your answer is the margin where you die. Your prefrontal cortex runs your real identity in parallel with the constructed one. Both tracks are active simultaneously. The cognitive load is enormous, the brain burning through glucose trying to keep two versions of you alive at once. When something breaks the script, an unexpected question, or a face you recognize from a previous operation, your response latency increases by a fraction of a second. That fraction is your entire survival margin. You wake at 3 in the morning to a sound that wasn't there. Your body is fully alert before your mind has identified the threat. That is the noradrenergic system overriding sleep, flooding your brain with a norepinephrine that treats the border between sleep and wakefulness as a liability. Over years of repeated deployments, the sleep debt accumulates, and your hippocampus begins to degrade. Slower memory consolidation, flattened emotional regulation, a creeping erosion of the precision your life depends on. The system was consuming itself to keep running. If the reality of this story is already hitting harder than the myth you expected, give this video a like, because Chapter 4 is where the cost of becoming a shinobi starts compounding chemically, physically, and permanently. Your diet during active operations was bland and deliberate. No garlic, no fermented fish, no pungent vegetables. Human olfactory detection is more reliable than most people account for. A guard whose nose catches something wrong in a dark corridor will raise an alert that his eyes never would have. Your smell was a variable you controlled. The Bansen Shukai documents stimulant preparations used to sustain alertness during multi-day surveillance plant compounds that pushed norepinephrine and dopamine high enough to keep you functional through a third consecutive night without sleep. What the text didn't record was the cumulative cost. Repeated stimulant cycles degrade the dopaminergic reward system over time. Your baseline capacity for motivation drops. The dose required to achieve the same alertness increases. You needed more to feel the same. You got less from everything else. Beneath all of it, chronic cortisol followed its standard path. Hippocampal shrinkage, immune suppression, cardiovascular stress building silently under a surface that showed nothing. Showing nothing was the entire job. The damage had nowhere to go except inward. The shinobi who survived long enough became a trainer. You passed the curriculum to children who didn't yet have a name for what was being built into them. The knowledge was transferred cleanly. The body that had carried it did not. The plantar fascia still aches in cold weather. The finger joints still wake before the rest of you. The sleep architecture never fully rebuilt itself into something restful. 20 years after your last operation, you sit in a room. and your peripheral vision still sweeps the exits before you register that you are doing it. You still read every person who enters from their shoulders and their breathing before they have spoken. The skills are intact. The nervous system carrying them is not. There was no pre-operational baseline to return to. The training had started before you were old enough to have one. What the tradition built in you, it built completely, and completely meant permanently. The historical record on shinobi longevity is sparse by design. The most effective practitioners left the fewest traces. What skeletal remains from Iga suggest is wear across multiple joint systems and injuries managed through rather than rested. You operated through the damage. The mission did not stop because your reserves were gone. The mission stopped when you did. You were never a supernatural figure. You were a person built from childhood into a specific operational tool, patient, invisible, precise, and running on a nervous system pushed past sustainable limits so many times that sustainable had stopped being a category you measured yourself against. The throwing stars were real but rare. The black suit was real but situational. The endurance required to spend 3 weeks as someone else in a building that would execute you if the mask slipped was the actual job. And that job left marks that no one wrote poems about because the tradition required that no one write about it at all. The mythology gave you a costume. The history gives you something harder to carry. A childhood that was never entirely yours. A nervous system that never fully stood down. A body worn into the shape of a role you were given before you were old enough to choose it. And a skill set so invisible that the world spent 5 centuries mythologizing the surface of it and never once looked at the cost underneath. Click the next video now to see what it truly took to be a samurai, the warrior who trained just as brutally, lived under the same relentless pressure, and was discarded just as quietly when his purpose was over.